Hi everyone, welcome to Vortexa's MENA Energy Insights recording. In this special April edition, we're joined by our dear friends at Argus Media, and besides me, I have Nader Itayim. Nader, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So for this edition, obviously so much has been happening in the market, so many things have changed. We're going to try and cut through some of the data and the noise, and some of the headlines, and really focus on what's happening with OPEC, what's been happening with changes in production policy, compliance, export trends, Iran, amongst other things. And we're also going to touch on the craziness that's been happening in response to the US Trump tariffs and its impact on oil markets. So without further ado, Nader, let's get into it.
Some of my favorite things. Let's do it.
So one of the biggest pieces of news that's come out in the past month is the return of more OPEC barrels into the market, especially from April. And obviously the other major issue is the tariffs implemented by Trump and how that can impact oil demand going forward. So let's start with what's happening with OPEC. And let's lay some background out, and let's look at what's happened with some of the main producers in OPEC and what's happened with their exports in January, February, and March. So at least looking at our data, what it seems like for the first 3 months of this year, most of the large producers have been pretty flat or maybe slightly lower. And I say slightly lower in the case of Saudi Arabia. We've seen in our data that their exports have actually moved a little bit lower compared to the start of this year. But that isn't that surprising for us, given that one of their key refineries, Jazan refinery, has come out of maintenance now. And so those volumes that were previously directed towards export market are probably serving their refinery. If we look at other key players in the region, UAE, Kuwait, we see relative stability with their exports, but we do see some changes in other countries. But I guess one of the biggest questions being asked right now is, how does that change in response to what's happening with Trump, with his actions, with his tariffs? Do you at Argus Media have any view of what's happening with global oil demand and what the sentiment is maybe on the back of Trump's announcements in the past month?
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, first things first, it really is difficult to remember a time when, the oil market has faced so many uncertainties all at the same time. If we're talking about tariffs and talking about, OPEC plus, I think the tariffs to an extent obviously were expected, possibly not the extent of the tariffs and what we've seen since, but the OPEC plus moves certainly were not. Now, in terms of the tariffs, we certainly do see, potential inflationary or growth suppressing impacts of those trade measures. That's both for the US, but also the global economy. At Argus, we see our global oil demand forecast for this year, it's slim to begin with. It was about 1.2 million barrels per day. Now, realistically, we're expecting to have that revised down over the coming few weeks and months, I guess, really as we start to see, what the impacts of those tariffs are and if there's some sort of stability, because right now it feels like every other week we're hearing some new news on that front. But the trade friction and all these elements, definitely we're expecting to see that. Now, when we're talking about uncertainty in particular, one major uncertainty here is kind of the duration of the tariffs in themselves, but also, and I say that because obviously just earlier this month, let's say, we saw Donald Trump basically pause or roll back for 90 days on a whole host of countries. So we're also likely going to see potentially lengthy discussions when it comes to their dilution over this period. And I don't think you should really be ruling out any retaliatory pressure or retaliatory measures, from some countries if, say, those discussions don't necessarily go as well as they should. So I think overall it's going to take time to assess kind of what those impacts will be, the impact on economic growth, on this new trade environment, as well as the oil demand implications.
I think it is worth mentioning here when it comes to tariffs, energy has been relatively safe, if I should say that word, when it comes to tariffs. But there is one major exception here, and that's China. Obviously, it's been an exception to the approach that the US has taken with other countries when it regards to the 90-day pause. And actually talking with our colleagues at Vortexa, we think that probably LPG is one of the most impacted parts of the barrel in response to what's happening. Obviously, tariffs, retaliatory tariffs have been escalating with China.
Yep.
And I guess one of the major concerns of the market is what will happen with how China sources its LPG, given that it's so reliant on US LPG at this stage. Looking at the way the flows are at this moment, it's still a little bit too early to see any changes, but people have said that maybe China will rely more heavily on the Middle East, so that could potentially be a benefit to some of the OPEC producers.
Absolutely.
Or alternatively, it may have to maybe cut down on some of its supply or do some switching, especially with steam crackers. But let's focus more specifically about OPEC now, Nader.
Sure.
And I guess one of the big surprises was this change in production. Just for the audience, do you want to just spell out a little bit more what happened, why it was different, and what that means, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think coming into the most recent meeting where they took these decisions, I think generally the expectation from the market in general was they're going to come, it's going to be something quick, they're going to rubber stamp a plan that they've already set in motion. We'll just, have the same increments that we had coming in April, again in June, in May, so on and so forth. Now, that didn't happen. What we ended up seeing was a surprise. Prince Abdulaziz, the Saudi energy minister, always loves a good surprise. And what we saw is a decision to essentially bring on 3 times as much oil to the market in May as than originally planned. I say bring that much production on. I think it's more factually correct to just say increase the output target, so to speak, the collective target by that much, because these countries are all working towards a quota. But there's this interesting element of compensation because some countries have been producing more in the past. So I think it's more factual to say targets. Anyway, them doing this took the market by surprise. Now, when they came out with the decision, really they all pointed to this idea that the market is healthy. We're sort of entering a period of improved demand in the summer months. That's pointing to U.S. driving season, but also regionally. In the region, you have fantastic demand over those periods of the year because air conditioning demand goes up, and really a lot of that extra production potentially will just be absorbed by the domestic economy here.
So specifically when it comes to products, I guess you're referring to, for example, fuel oil.
Absolutely, yeah. Essentially the liquids that are burnt to generate electricity here. So that was what they said. The thing is, over the coming hours and days after that, we started to realize, okay, this was possibly a part of the decision, but the main driving force behind this was really more to do with internal dynamics within the group. And I say that because, touching on the compensation issue that I said, you have these 8 producers led by Saudi Arabia and Russia who have been cutting this 2.2 billion barrels per day for some time now. They are the ones who are going to be bringing back these volumes over the next year and a half. Yeah. The thing is that within these 8 producers, there are 2 or 3 who have not really been doing what they said they would be doing, in the sense that they've been overproducing, and not just by nominal, barrels here and there, quite significantly. Yeah. To be fair, of the 8 producers, 7 of them have overproduced, but to vastly differing kind of extents. The scale is everything. Yeah. So you have the likes of Kazakhstan and Iraq, who are very much in the spotlight. These are countries who have, for months on end, even possibly years, they've been overproducing. OPEC Plus has said, look, you can't continue to do this. Something has to be done here. And they will come out on a regular basis and say, we're committed to this agreement. We're going to bring our production down, so on and so forth. Months come, months go, nothing changes. So within this group, there has been this frustration bubbling up, essentially, from countries saying, why on earth are we having to curtail our production and adhere to quotas when these countries simply are not? So to maintain that kind of cohesion, essentially, OPEC Plus had to go, or Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus, they had to do something to say, look, we hear you, to those producers who are getting frustrated. We're going to do something about it. Is it extreme? Absolutely. At this point in time, it looks extreme. But I think they took this decision thinking, look, we have to show them that this is not something we can do. If you're going to overproduce, we're going to produce more. And essentially, that price benefit that you've been enjoying, producing more at a higher price, you're not going to get that. So we saw that for May. What happens next? It's hard to see, but these next few weeks, are going to be critical here, because if we see some kind of improvement or an actual genuine show from these countries that have been overproducing that they're trying to actually bring down the production and compensate and hit their quota, so on and so forth, then I think things could go back to normal and we could see these countries bringing on, these monthly, about 138,000 barrels per day per month. But if they don't show that, we could see Saudi Arabia and company kind of, again, crack the whip.
Yeah.
Do we see another 3-month hike in June? I don't want to say. We don't know yet, but it's possible. So it's a really interesting dynamic to look at.
It's interesting because at Vortexa, we see the same thing in our data as well, right? From the perspective of exports, we see Kazakhstan and Iraqi exports really have climbed quite significantly since the second half of last year, especially. And looking at the data for what the production should look like, very divergent trends for both of these countries. One thing I wanted to just go back a little bit on was this action that was announced by OPEC. I think you said some of it was to do with summer demand, and that was something to consider. At least when we look at Vortexa data at a global level, what's happening with demand, we have this really interesting measurement, which is looking at refined product imports at like the top 100 ports. So that really gives a good perspective into how much diesel, how much gasoline, how much jet is going into places where there's a lot of consumption. And for many, many months now, we've seen those numbers really look quite weak. No real sign of super growth in either of the major regions. So at least from our perspective, product demand and therefore consumption doesn't look super strong. Yeah. The argument of gasoline having strength is purely a seasonal one. But on our data, at least, we don't really see a major upshoot there. So I think, it's probably a combination of things which has driven OPEC to take this action. And I think one other point is just the breakdown of where this extra supply will come from, right? Which countries are probably going to add the most supply over this 3-month period? I think it's Saudi Arabia and UAE, right?
Absolutely. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I mean, they're the two big producers here. Iraq is obviously a bigger producer on paper than the UAE is.
Yep.
But the interesting thing about Iraq is being one of those major historic overproducers, they have a lot to compensate for. They have production debts, so to speak. So there's a lot of expectation on them to not only hit their quotas, but also produce well below that quota. And by well below, I think we're talking, I don't know, maybe a bit over 100,000 barrels per day per month. Each of these countries that have overproduced, they have their kind of these compensation schedules, and that's what it's suggesting. So in terms of, I think the focus definitely is going to be on Saudi Arabia, on the UAE as well. The UAE is also obviously going to enjoy this gradual increase to its baseline or quota now. It feels like we've shifted away a little bit from this baseline idea. Baselines was big for maybe 2-3 years, but then I think last year, or might have been late 2023, but we saw this shift in the language from OPEC. They stopped talking about baselines because I think they were getting a little bit of it was becoming a touchy subject for lots of countries who wanted to make changes to those. So we moved to this kind of idea of quota, also because the baselines were based on very, very historic data, historic capacity that many of these countries, it just wasn't valid anymore.
Yeah.
So if we talk about the quotas, the UAE is basically going to enjoy a very, very gradual increase to its quota, again, over the same 18-month period that they set out. So until I think it's September 2026, if I'm not mistaken. So, for those two reasons, really, you're going to see most of the additional production or quota increases come from those. I would throw Kuwait also in that mix.
Okay, interesting.
In the sense that their increments are also minor over the month, but I think Kuwait is that not silent partner, but it's that. It's one of the core OPEC producers that isn't looked upon. The focus isn't much on them because obviously definitely. The UAE has these fantastic expansion plans, which they're frankly almost delivering. I think they're almost at that 5 million barrel per day. Saudi Arabia obviously has pulled the brakes on its own expansion plan, but still it has such massive spare capacity that it's always going to be a big sort of part of the conversation. Kuwait. Right now, its cap here is around 2.413, if I'm not mistaken. Obviously, they're going to be allowed to produce a little bit more, but in theory, they also have a spare capacity of somewhere in the region of 500,000 barrels per day, which is not nothing. I mean, this is, they themselves are in the middle of their own expansion plan, albeit a much expansion plan over a much longer period of time. They're basically hoping to increase capacity to about 4 million barrels per day by 2035. So it's a long period of time, but still they have come out with shorter term targets of maybe 3.25 by this year, up from about 2.9 currently.
Okay, so that's still a significant
It
chunk,
is,
right?
but I don't think they're going to. I think they've pulled the brakes on that slightly. I think if we've listened to the KPC chief in the US last month at CERAWeek, he was sort of suggesting that we're working on this, but given the state of the market, given the fact that we have so much spare capacity, given that we're working to these OPEC plus quotas, there isn't really a need for us to go supercharge on this plan at the moment. So I think more realistically, we'll see them inch up this year, but possibly 3.25 this year will come too early for that, too soon for that. Maybe next year, 2026.
So in short, when it comes to the main possibility of extra supply, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and potentially Kuwait. One country which we haven't really discussed yet, obviously one of the most important countries when it comes to oil production, oil exports, is Russia. Where do they stand in terms of production, at least when it comes to the Argus view, and also I guess from a relationship perspective, how does it stand in its power within the core group?
Yeah, so Russia is interesting because obviously Russia is also one of the two or three countries that have overproduced consistently. The thing is, anyone who's watching OPEC or OPEC Plus in particular, obviously, Russia seems to have always held this very special place within this group, in the sense that, along with Saudi Arabia, this is a co-chair, okay, which means that it oversees. As the two biggest producers, naturally, they're going to hold the most weight here. But while Saudi Arabia has been the more active, leader, always taking that initial step, leading by example, leading from the front, taking these massive hits and just, making announcements of massive cuts that they're going to shoulder just to keep the group together. Obviously, Russia's been going through a different situation of its own, sanctions, so on and so forth. But even before that, Russia was never the perfect student here. They were always they're always lacking when it came to conformity, compliance with their targets. They would always overproduce a little bit here and there. You'd never get the group kind of focus on them and say, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? You need to compensate. They would be asked to compensate, but they would very regularly not, and just not put forward. So the reasons for that, simply, this is too big a producer to be not pushed around, or to be kind of
dictated to,
like some of the others. This is an important producer, a 10 million barrel per day producer. It adds a lot to this group. I think Saudi Arabia made it clear several years ago that, possibly OPEC cannot manage the market in the same way that it did before. And we need to have the likes of these massive producers like Russia, like, some of the others, to join us. So I think them being part of the group is such a critical element of this, what they're doing today, that I think they're allowed, people sort of turn the cheek every now and then, and they're allowed to kind of, I guess, not deliver fully. But as long as they do well enough, they're going to be allowed. So Russia is overproducing. They have some compensation to deliver. I'm not personally convinced they're going to be delivering much of that. I might be surprised. But for the time being, at least, I think.
Well, at least when it comes to the exports, according to our data, it's been pretty consistent. So for all of the news of sanctions being applied to tankers and entities related to Russian trade, yes, we've seen changes in the logistics of it, but actually when it comes to the exports, it's been pretty consistent, and we are still seeing those flows happen. Maybe they take longer to get where they need to get to, namely China and India, but those flows still continue to happen. And honestly, I don't really see much change in that anytime soon. And so, Russia obviously will retain its role as a key supplier of the market, and of course a key supplier to China. One of the other sources of discounted barrels to China is, of course, Iran. And right now, at this time, it's very important what's happening with Iran, the optics around it. I guess what's your view on what's happening there from a
What's more interesting to me is the fact that I feel like if we were having this conversation maybe 1 month ago, I think if anyone said how high is the Iran issue when it comes to how Trump sees the world right now, you wouldn't necessarily put it that high up. It felt like his focus was more on Russia, Ukraine, or what's happening in the Middle East in terms of Gaza and Israel. But a few weeks have passed, and clearly the focus on the Iran file has increased, sharpened, however you want to call it. Just earlier this month, it was last month that we saw this exchanging of letters, and then where was this going to go? No one was sure, and then you kind of hear, with Iran in particular, you have to sort of read the tea leaves a little bit. They like to speak in riddles, especially the supreme leader. So you fast forward a few weeks until this month, and surprise, surprise, we're in a situation where even the Trump administration, not all of them, some, he in particular, is the tone has changed, shifted towards Iran. Iran's tone has shifted towards the U.S., and we actually saw a first meeting, in effect, in Oman earlier this month between Iran and the U.S. There was a lot of talk about whether it's going to be indirect or direct. Trump is uninterested in that kind of indirect stuff. Iran wanted to kind of create its own rules, so to speak. Sorry,
do you think that this change in tone when it comes to Iran is possibly a consequence of what we were talking about before with regards to changes in OPEC policy, the extra production coming through? Do you think there's an element of safety within the group in giving themselves margin to produce more and export more at the risk of potentially Iranian supplies being crimped more than they are right now?
Whether that's the driving force behind Trump's change in tone in particular, is that what you're talking about? I wouldn't necessarily say that's it. I think Trump, if you just look at his character, he is someone who, the Iran issue was always going to be high up at some point over this his time in office. But I think he has this obsession here to kind of this whole thing, art of a deal. He clearly wants to make this deal. And I think he has seen an opportunity here where, again, strangely, if we look 4 weeks ago versus now, strangely, the Iran file seems to now be the one where he might, get success first, progress, make some progress that the others really aren't showing. Yes, we had the ceasefire deal in Gaza, but that kind of fell apart. Russia and Ukraine doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So strangely, this now has come to the fore. And I just feel like he sees the opportunity. I think Iran has now been cornered in a way that it senses that it needs something. I think economically it's struggling.
I guess that doesn't help when the flat price is so low as well.
Absolutely, and although Iran is still doing fairly well when it comes to its exports, it's not probably at the highs that it was maybe a few months ago. These U.S. sanctions that have come in, they are having an impact on essentially the trade because obviously, as you guys know very well, Iran's primary buyer, if not only buyer here, is China. So
exactly.
There has been an impact there. It's not about, this whole idea of driving Iran's oil exports to zero. I think that's a fantasy.
Sure.
It was then, it still is. It surprised me the Trump administration insisted on bringing this line out again this time around, although when they realized they couldn't do it.
But then it could feed back into your point about being the art of the deal, right?
Yeah.
Making these kind of comments.
Absolutely. So you do that and it shows that you're kind of being benevolent to them. We say, we wanted to do this, but we're not going to do it, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of moving pieces. I think that the good thing is that, well, good depending on what side of the issue you're on, but I feel like there is the first few steps. It's still very, very early days. But the first few steps that we've seen, the comments we've seen, the readouts that we've heard, just the general kind of tone on both sides, it's positive. So whereas I think maybe, I don't know, we might have been looking at the potential for maximum pressure in Iran, losing, 500,000 barrels per day from the market. I think now the conversation may be more about, okay, Iran will maintain. But who knows? Trump has put this 2-month, deadline on some kind of an agreement being struck. I think the idea of a full thing being struck is not realistic. An interim deal. If we see that, then maybe we see.
So my view here is that it's a little bit Jekyll and Hyde because on one hand, at least at the current moment, the relationship between China and the US is quite full of friction. The tariffs keep escalating, and on the other hand, China is the biggest consumer of Iranian oil. So anything that will facilitate Iranian oil exports to continue or to maybe rise even so slightly is probably to the benefit of China and only China.
Yeah.
So on one hand, better discussions, better tone between the US and Iran, and on the other hand, the relationship between the US and China is seeming to be more tense.
Yeah.
From our perspective, I think one of the important questions is what's going to happen with Chinese demand. And when I say Chinese demand, I mean Chinese demand for discounted barrels.
Yep.
And I think we've both been looking at oil markets for a decent enough time to know that when the oil price is this low, China is typically a buyer of oil.
Yep.
And Iranian oil is probably some of the cheapest oil that there is on the market. And so it's a little surprise to us that from our perspective, those imports into China from Iran keep happening, and every effort is being made, many different techniques, many different ways to kind of circumvent rules, regulations, or sanctions in some cases is being made to ensure that flow is happening.
No, it is fascinating. And I mean, it's questions we get asked all the time in terms of, what's happening there when it comes to the sanctions. The U.S. is coming out with sanctions every 1 or 2 weeks. Are they having an impact? Obviously, I think if we're looking at the numbers or even the narrative, you feel like 1 month they're down, second month they're up. It's cat and mouse, right?
Yep.
Ultimately, pressure is being put here, but then the teapots, so on and so forth, and they're going to find an alternative way here. I think it was interesting that, several weeks ago you had this designation, the sanctions placed on a teapot refinery. It was the first time it was placed. It's not the first time it was placed on a refinery. So the teapot refinery by the U.S. There was one during the Biden administration a few years ago, but that was a bit different. That was essentially that refinery was sanctioned for basically using a sanctioned vessel. But in this case, it's the first time it's being targeted, for actually engaging with an IRGC front company, so on and so forth. So it's interesting, and I think even my own initial reaction was, when we're talking about the teapots, they don't have exposure to the U.S., they should be fine. But these are secondary sanctions. They're going to impact their business, and it's going to ultimately, they will struggle to sell to any foreign buyers. They're going to struggle to deal with. There's going to be many state companies that will not want to deal with them. Essentially, these are cash poor businesses. They're going to struggle, and they're already running on fumes. So I think that particular refinery had to go and get new bank accounts and just reach out, give phone calls. Will you take this product? So I think really, again, questions of, does the U.S. continue to do this? Do we go and see more similar designations? I think possibly yes, because it will have an impact, but there's a sweet spot here in terms of if you designate 1 or 2 refineries, 3, a few here and there, you can sort of put the fear of God in them and they won't know what to do. But if you go overboard and start to do 5, 10, 15, ultimately you're creating a situation in which suddenly you have this massive fleet cohort of refineries that are all in the same situation. They're going to find
it's such a good example that you say, because it draws a very nice parallel with what's happened with OPEC and the fleet on Russia, right? So when you sanction so many tankers, what's happened is now we have this tier where so much trade, so many tankers are operating in this trade, and it's just a bifurcation of the market basically. It doesn't stop the market.
So I don't know that's going to happen, but there we go. You have a good example that it could actually happen, but I don't see them going that far at the moment. Let's wait and see. And with all the conversations that are going on, when it comes to the Iran-US file, who knows? If things get a bit more, or less tense rather, you might see a calming on that side of things, because one of the biggest frustrations you've had out of Tehran is, look, you're coming and telling us let's talk, but with one hand, you're saying let's talk, and with the other hand, you're basically slapping sanctions on us every other week. You're putting pressure and so on and so forth. At least the tone has kind of eased a bit. So in that sense, there's positive signals, but definitely an interesting story to follow.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess following the theme of geopolitics, but maybe moving more towards the shipping side, one of the key themes has been the risk of transiting the Red Sea. Obviously, the attacks by the Houthis on Western-linked tankers has really cut down flows through Bab el-Mandeb, through Suez. In summary, what's the current situation right now between the US and the Houthis, and how would you describe that?
Yeah, so the Houthis have essentially dubbed themselves the protectors of humanity, and they're the ones who are now fighting their own, the battle for the Palestinians. Given what's been happening since October 2023, you had for a period of time there was this whatever generally known as Iranian proxies, this axis of resistance. You'd have Hezbollah, you'd have Hamas in Gaza, you'd have the Houthis in Yemen, and some resistance groups kind of in Iraq, all kind of fighting back, so to speak, on the Palestinians' behalf against Israel. Now, obviously, in that period of time, you've had severe degradation of several of those groups. Hezbollah is really not what it was before. Hamas has been degraded hugely. The Houthis are the ones who, until maybe about a month or so ago, they were the ones who were the most intact. They had stopped. I mean, their biggest kind of tool over this period was essentially attacking vessels that they said at first were only Israel-linked vessels, or they broadened it out to any vessels that were linked to governments that were helping the Israelis or considered to be aggressors, so on and so forth. But once the ceasefire deal was agreed, they stopped. A lot of people didn't think they would. They felt like they had essentially been jumping on the bandwagon of this issue and using it for their own purposes. I'm not going to say they weren't. Obviously, everyone's going to work to their own interests. But they did actually stop, and it wasn't until, again, things started to flare up in Gaza that they said, actually, if you guys don't sort things out, we're going to start attacking ships again. It was first Israeli-linked vessels, and then the Americans waded in, and then it's now become a much bigger thing than it was just a few short weeks ago. So the U.S. essentially made it their kind of purpose here to return freedom of navigation in those waterways, in the Bab el-Mandeb, and the nearby waters. And now you're seeing on an almost daily basis significant airstrikes on Houthi targets from the U.S. government. The Houthis are retaliating by, attacking military vessels in the Red Sea, and also shooting on drones and things. But essentially, we're seeing this continue. The Biden administration did do something similar, but not quite to this extent. Those were more sporadic attacks. These attacks from this Trump administration are more targeting, if they seem to be targeting, Houthi leadership, which is different. And they've been doing so for a while. I mean, you'll hear U.S. officials talking about taking out, this leader and that leader. But still, you don't really see, the most interesting thing is you don't really see much of an impact on those Houthis, really. They continue to hit, they continue to retaliate, which is the interesting thing. I saw something which I found quite interesting or funny in a way. Someone referred to the Houthis as the honey badger of resistance. I don't know if you've come across this reference, the honey badger, in the sense that, they relish the fight. So the more you hit them, the harder they're going to come back. So this is a situation we're at the moment, and obviously it's still having an impact. I'm not sure. I mean, you can tell me better if it's having any impact on flows or.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, when we look at the flows, right, there's a few key trades which were reliant on that route and now have shifted. So I guess the main ones are from the Mideast Gulf and from the West Coast, India, diesel, jet fuel, and crude from the Middle East heading into Europe through the Suez, through Bab el-Mandeb. That's much lower than it was, let's say, a year or two years ago, to be fair. But on the flip side of it, when it comes to Russian oil moving out from the Baltic or the Black Sea and then heading through the Suez towards India or China, that flow has pretty much continued without any disruption. There was a little bit of an uptick in the amount of activity going through Bab el-Mandeb and Suez in March, and that coincided with this kind of ceasefire. So there was a little bit of a relaxation in some of the perception of risk, but really, as you've just described, right, the risks or the decrease in risk were short-lived, and so I think we're pretty much back to where we were. And I guess the question is, do we see that likely to change anytime soon? I'm sure people that have cargoes that they want to move from east to west are thinking, is it possible that duration of routes will decrease anytime soon, or maybe freight rates will get cheaper because inefficiencies aren't as large? But yeah.
I don't know. In terms of the situation on the ground, it's hard to see things improve anytime soon, purely because, as I said, we have seen a bombing campaign, the likes of which we hadn't seen before. This is some significant bombing, and as I said, they've talked about many Houthi leaders kind of being eliminated, but there really is little to suggest that the upper echelons of that group are not intact. They seem to be there. They seem to be continuing what they're doing. Even when it comes to some launching pads, they're still there despite all the bombing. So, and in terms of the Houthis, I think the thing we have to worry about, I guess, is although the relationship between the Houthis and sort of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, I don't want to say it's fine now, far from it, but there's been an understanding that we are not going to be attacking these countries anytime. So we understand this is the base level of how we're going to do things. The concern here is that if this continues, the Houthis' only kind of escalation essentially would be to go and hit these countries nearby, which obviously would be a disaster for both.
Sure.
So I don't want to say it's going to happen, but I'm just saying that's I guess something to watch going forward. The Houthis have been weakened, or they're not quite what they were, because you are seeing supply routes being cut in terms of weapons supply, so on and so forth. But it feels like the only way we're going to see further pressure on the Houthis, or actual impact on their ability to do what they're doing, is if you have boots on the ground. I don't think anybody's interested in that. The Yemenis, the Houthis are not. They are a force that no one really would be keen to actually get into a ground combat with. They will do very well. So especially this particular U.S. president has no interest in doing such a thing. I think most wouldn't, but I think when it comes to Trump and his view on kind of wars, this whole idea of him wanting to pull the U.S. out of wars, not, at least when you're striking from the above, keeping them at arm's length, you're doing your thing from there. But I think, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So unfortunately, I'd say I think this Red Sea issue is going to rumble on for some time.
Yeah. Well, I think that rounds up our fantastic discussion today, Nader. Thank you so much for joining us at Vortexa. It's great to have our friends at Argus over for this edition. We thank our listeners for tuning in, and we hope to see you on the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay.